So in the last presentation, we were talking about the cultural construction of identity. And in this presentation, we're going to bring in another key term, which is reciprocity. So, of course, we saw a lot about reciprocity, or we will be seeing, if you haven't watched it yet, a lot about reciprocity in the film Anka's Big Maka that is assigned for this week. Mary Douglas is actually a useful person to be thinking about to kind of bridge this idea of identity and reciprocity. Mary Douglas is a 20th century British anthropologist who did a lot of work on a range of topics. She's known for her work with symbolism, especially regarding purity and pollution and food taboos. She also wrote a book called The World of Goods in 1979, and this book really explored the relationship between identity and things. She argued that what we own is tied to our identities. People buy things not just because those things are useful and have utility in their lives, but because they're actually tied to their identities. So under economic conditions where we can make an abundance of goods, we would imagine that there's a lot of things around. There's abundance being the result of extra productivity that's gained by not having to spend as much time on sustenance. We would really expect this connection between identity and things to emerge in that situation. However, we see this in other societies as well. In a lot of societies where you don't see this abundance of goods being created, you see identity being tied to competitive gift giving instead of what you own. So instead of the collection of objects being something that is tied to your identity, the giving of objects is what is tied to identity. Marcel Mauss is a famous anthropologist who, well, he's actually a French sociologist, but we know of him a lot in anthropology, who really thought about what it meant to be giving things and what it meant to have reciprocity. He was the student and nephew of Emile Durkheim, which you may recall Durkheim was one of our founding 3 most influential figures in anthropology. Marcel Mauss wrote Essays on the Gift in 1925. It's a very short book, but brought into social studies this idea that reciprocity is a system of exchange between roughly social equals, but that it's not only a system of exchange, it's really an act of moral relationship. In other words, it's not just about what is being given that's important or what is being gotten that is important. It's the relationship that's involved in this gift-giving practice that is key. If you think about reciprocity, someone always owes something. So the relationship continues in perpetuity. If someone gives you a gift on your birthday, you have to give them a gift on their birthday, and it's really the relationship that the gift giving maintains that's the key thing. If someone doesn't return the gift, then there's a question in terms of the status of the relationship. Reciprocity has been important in anthropology because we can really learn a lot when we look at the rules of how gifts are exchanged. We can learn a number of things about what's going on in a culture, especially the way relationships are formed and maintained and the types of relationships that are important. Reciprocity has 2 main things that we have to make sure we're really recognizing that are built into it. So the first thing is that equivalence is important. So exchange tends to involve a gift of roughly equal value. If there's a gift-giving exchange that happens and someone gives a gift that's worth far more than the other person, then there's questions that arise. I actually had a personal experience with this in my own family, in which my sister-in-law came into the family and started participating with the rest of us, exchanging Christmas gifts, which my family celebrates Christmas, so it's what we do. And she was giving gifts that were valued much higher than the rest of us were giving. And this became something that made people uncomfortable, concerned about it looking like other people didn't care as much or didn't have as much to give, etc. So I think my mother actually was the one who spoke with her, and she eventually started giving gifts that were worth less, to kind of even things out and that were more equivalent with what the rest of us were giving. So these things become really important, and it's not really about the item, it's about the relationships involved in keeping things on an equal playing field. The second aspect of reciprocity that's really key is time. So a certain amount of time needs to pass before the next gift is given. If everything is always given at the same time, there wouldn't be a relationship really being maintained. The time has to pass so that there's an ongoingness to the relationship. Of course, in Anka's Big Mocha, we see this happening. We see the concern about equivalence to a degree, but there's also a cultural aspect in which what needs to be given actually has to be more, and then that puts pressure, a lot of pressure, on the next person to give even more in return. But the Mocha is a system of a whole, is a system that actually keeps the peace. It's a way of making a name for oneself, and it keeps the relationship between villages in good standing. So this is a system that is really important in those communities. All over the world, people operate within a framework, and Mocha is one of them that we can be thinking about. If you notice, in Anka's Big Mocha, in his village, authority is not really connected to holding office or something like that. Instead, it's very different. The type of influence that Anka will have if he is able to give this Mocha is not really the same as having a kind of determined political authority. It's really great that he wants to bring off this one event. He wants to be able to actually give so much, but it's short term. It's ephemeral. It doesn't last this whole lifetime as a big man. He's always in the constant threat of losing his authority in this way, the authority that he does have. And this is a form of balanced reciprocity, which I'll be talking about later. We can see the moral pressure that he's brought under in this gift-giving practice. It will really look poorly on his character if he does not return what he's supposed to return or repay what he owes to his fellow big men. Everyone in these tribes, you'll notice, has the same access to resources, more or less. No one is homeless, so wealth, instead of being gathered and being shown off as a source of prestige and status, is actually gathered and then given away, and it's the giving away of the wealth that is actually the source of prestige and status. So we'll talk more about Anka's Big Mocha in the discussion. I don't want to say too much more about it in case you have not watched it yet. So the next aspect that I want to talk about regarding reciprocity is an important contribution by the anthropologist Marshall Solons. So Solons is actually known for emphasizing the importance of history in anthropology, but he also recognized three overall categories of reciprocity: generalized, balanced, and negative. So I'm going to go through each of these. When Marcel Mauss was writing, I think he was mainly interested in balanced reciprocity, and Marshall Solons recognized a couple other areas we need to be looking at, or ways of thinking about reciprocity. So the first one is generalized reciprocity, which is a form of exchange in which people share what they have with only the vague expectation of return. So in this situation, the return doesn't have the same sense of obligation that it has in the other forms of reciprocity. A classic example of this is parents and children. So parents give to their children with only a vague expectation of return. In Western cultures, the community I grew up in, it's expected that parents will provide for their children, and children do very little in return with for their parents. However, there is a vague expectation that children, once grown, will care for their parents as their parents age. So that's why it's a vague expectation. It's generalized reciprocity if, when there's no return, the giver still continues to give more gifts, and the lack of return does not end the relationship, or even really call the relationship into great question. So balanced reciprocity is the main type that we've been talking about through most of the other examples. Balanced reciprocity is a form of exchange in which people share with others but then expect them to reciprocate later. An example that most of us are probably familiar with is if you go out to a meal, lunch date, or something with friends, if they pay, then the next time you should pay. And there's a moral aspect to this, that if someone doesn't pay when it's their turn, we question their morals to some degree. It reflects poorly on them for whatever reason. And the last one is negative reciprocity. So in this you have exchange in which the goal is to get something for nothing or to make a profit. So classic examples to think about: trading baseball cards. I don't know if people really do this anymore, but when people trade baseball cards, the idea is to give away a card that's not worth very much and gain something that's worth a lot. I would imagine that this happens with actual real trades of sports team or of athletes and sports teams as well. And if you think about it, the whole capitalistic system that our economic model is comprised of is based with this idea of exchange, in which you want to buy low and sell high. Making a profit, gaining capital, is the goal of the system. And you can see that how morality is connected with this as well. On the one hand, if someone is able to trade a card that's not worth very much and gain one that is worth a lot, we might think of them as clever, having thought of a clever way of trading to make that happen. On the other hand, we might also think of them as taking advantage of the person that they received the card that was worth a lot from. And there's probably moments where someone might want to make a trade and not make it because they think it would be really them getting too much, a card that's too good for what they were giving away. So we can see morality connected to that as well. With the example of capitalism in general, of course we can see how we make moral judgments based on this type of negative reciprocity that's inherent in the system as well. People use terms like greed and selfishness and so on when describing the system. So we can see that connection. Next week we'll be continuing to talk about Anka's Big Milka, especially as an example of reciprocity, but also how we can, what we can learn from the system we see at play in Anka to help us understand social hierarchy a little bit more. Okay, thank you for listening.